about 12,000 North Korean soldiers have been put into combat. It looks like about 3,000 of them have been killed or wounded. So already 25% have been become casualties, and now you've got a couple that are captured. It'll be interesting to see what we learn from them, but it looks like North Koreans, to avoid being captured, are getting killed by Russians or their fellow soldiers if they're wounded, to avoid becoming captured in many cases. And unsurprisingly, at least one of the two said that he thought he was coming there for training.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine. And I'm delighted to be joined by one of our favourite guests here on Frontline, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. General Hodges served for 38 years in the US Army, commanding in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was Commander US Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. General, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Thank you for the privilege.
Now, here we are a week out from the second inauguration of Donald Trump. As someone who has been very public in their support for Ukraine and your desire for their sovereign borders to be respected and restored, what are you expecting from the second Trump administration?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure. And in fact, I think President-elect Trump is not entirely sure what his ultimate goal is for Ukraine in this war in Ukraine. A few months ago, I think most of us would have written off Ukraine based on what he said. I mean, he talked about we're going to end it in 24 hours, and he never criticizes Russia or Putin. And so it was, I was not optimistic. But in the last few weeks, I've seen and heard different things that give me a little bit of reason for hope. First of all, Trump is realizing he's going to enter with a lot more leverage over Putin than he had 8 years ago. Putin is in deep trouble. Russia's economy is in deep trouble. They've lost 800,000 casualties. And after 11 years of war, they still only control about 20% of Ukraine. On the other hand, President Trump is taking over one of the best economies in the world. I mean, publicly, he criticizes Biden all the time, but the fact is, the American economy is in great shape. We've got 31 allies that have many common interests. And so, and he, of course, he sits politically in the US, he's in a very strong position. So I'm hoping that Trump will say, you know what, I'm going to use this leverage over Putin to accomplish what it is Trump wants to do. There are $2 billion worth of aid that were already approved by the Congress that the Biden administration was unable to deliver or will not get delivered by Inauguration Day next Monday. Trump doesn't have to do a thing. And that's $2 billion worth of aid that's already approved. So that could go. And I think also there will be people who will convince the president elect that this is about deterring China, which the Republicans have always talked about was a higher priority. Anyway, finally, the Mr. Kellogg, General Kellogg, as the envoy, has publicly talked about, for negotiating with Russia, you can't trust Russia. That's a great starting point if you're going to negotiate with Russia, is to publicly acknowledge you cannot trust them. And also, Kellogg has emphasized the importance of Ukraine's sovereignty. And then Mr. Waltz, who is the national security advisor, also seems to be a Russia hawk, if you will. So I'm a little bit more optimistic now than I was a few months ago.
It's a really interesting point you raise around Kellogg and Waltz, and I suppose one of the big questions of the second administration is whose voices will win out in the end, because you have some Russia hawks in there, but you also have people like JD Vance, people like Tulsi Gabbard, who've been far more skeptical about support for Ukraine. Do you think Vladimir Putin realizes privately the weakness of his own position, or is he merely trying to project a sense of strength to the world ahead of potential peace talks? Because, I mean, according to the Financial Times, a senior Kremlin official and another official who's discussed this with Putin says that the Russian president still maintains his maximalist pre-war demands to isolate Ukraine and weaken NATO, and he wants to take those demands into any possible peace talks with Trump. Do you think that is just Putin trying to project strength, or do you think actually he hasn't fully appreciated the weakness of his own position?
Well, some excellent points there. First, I don't know for sure who has the ultimate influence on Trump. inside his official circle and his unofficial circle. Clearly, Elon Musk and Donald Trump Jr., his son, seem to have enormous influence on what Trump does and thinks. I'm not convinced that's going to last forever or it will cover all things. And even inside the sort of MAGA world, you've got a little bit of a civil war going on where you've got the Musk and Ramaswamy and Donald Trump Jr. wing are coming at this from one perspective, and then on the other side you've got Vance and Peter Thiel, Bannon, who are the more traditional, if you will, MAGA, and so this is going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Now, to your question about Putin, I think it's always hard to know how much he really knows. I mean, in a system where reporting bad news is a real problem and a danger for people inside the Ministry of Defense, for example, I'm not 100% certain he knows exactly how bad things might be either at the front or inside his own economy. But I mean, he's been in power for over 2 decades. He's former. You always hear about he's former KGB guy, and everybody that's in power is there because he put them there. So he has to be aware that they've been emptying their oil fund, the sovereign fund. Banks are using all kinds of artificial props to keep things going, and the economy, the defense economy, is still in tatters. I mean, they have to depend on North Korea for ammunition. So in my view, this is another place where Trump will have leverage. And so Putin has to project power. He has to project this maximalist approach that you've accurately described, because his only hope of winning, his only hope for Russia is that the US, UK, the rest of Europe turns their back on Ukraine. If we were to get serious about using economic pressure, like stopping the shadow fleet, for example, they would collapse in the next 6 months.
And do you have confidence, General, that the US under Trump would be prepared potentially, if Putin isn't willing to negotiate, to ramp up support for Ukraine, which is what General Kellogg has previously outlined, that if Putin doesn't come to the table, he's prepared to arm Ukraine to the teeth? I mean, that's very bold language. Do you really think that a second Trump administration would be prepared to do that?
Well, what you're talking about, of course, these are policy decisions about whether or not to provide more aid to Ukraine or to unleash them, if you will, let them use everything we give them any way they want. These are policy decisions, and policy decisions have to flow, to be effective, have to flow from a desired strategic outcome. And I'm not sure what the Trump strategic outcome is. I would hope it has to do with ending the fighting between Russia and Ukraine, but in a way that's favorable to Europe and to the United States. And I think that ultimately is what's going to drive Trump foreign policy, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, is whatever he thinks is to the advantage of the United States, and what would also have the greatest effect on China. If he thinks like that, then I think we're going to see a very positive support for Ukraine, because those will be the outcomes. It won't be a big moral decision, I'm sure. It will be driven by pure what's in America's strategic interest in the mind of Donald Trump.
And isn't this where there's a huge onus on Ukraine's allies in Europe? Because in Trump's eyes, he sees Europe as sort of, I don't know, well, maybe freeloading is the way he sees it, off American military spending. And he sees Ukraine almost as part of that context, that America is paying for European security. If the Europeans were to significantly increase both their military aid to Ukraine, but also their own defense budgets, and we've had Donald Trump in recent days saying he wants to see NATO countries increase their percentage of GDP spent on defense to 5%, which would be a huge amount. I don't think that's realistic, but you can see the direction of travel he wants them to go in. If Europe were willing to make that kind of commitment, would that allow Donald Trump, both internally and to the American public, be able to say, look, we're not having to bankroll Europe's security as we did under the Biden administration?
So yes, that's a very plausible way to to look at it. And I think that's probably what Trump would like to do. He would like to take credit for Europe increasing its spending and for taking on more, and then Trump get the credit for it. And I think actually most European leaders are fine to let him have the credit as long as the United States does not abandon Europe or take away its nuclear deterrent or just completely turn its back on Ukraine. Because at the end of the day, I live here in Germany. Germany will be a huge loser if Ukraine fails. You're going to see millions more Ukrainian refugees coming here, continued disruption of the European economy because of disruption of food supplies and energy supplies. I mean, there are no positive outcomes for Germany and for Europe if Ukraine fails. Now, I think Secretary General Mark Rutte, when he visited President-elect Trump at Mar-a-Lago several weeks ago, of course, we don't know exactly what the conversation was, but I feel pretty confident that one of the things Rutte told Mr. Trump was, look, don't turn your back on us. We need American leadership and participation in NATO, but also against Ukraine. And we'll make sure you get all the credit, Mr. President, but also if Ukraine fails, it will be on your watch and you will be seen as the loser. And I think that's a powerful incentive for Trump not to be the loser. I think that Rutte probably has said that you're going to see more and more European countries continue to increase defense spending, continue to support Ukraine. I was just reading this morning the French have provided 120 something Caesar artillery pieces already. I mean, that's an enormous amount of artillery, and that's just one tiny little example. But I will say it is inexcusable that Europe as a whole is not doing more. The combined economies of Europe dwarfs Russia. I mean, this should not even be a talking point. It's such a huge advantage that Europe has if it can work together on the economic policies, such as making sure that Russia cannot export oil and gas out through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, but also in increasing ammunition production, et cetera, the things that Ukraine needs.
And I was really interested, General, by your argument that this should be framed as the best way of containing China, and that support for Ukraine should be viewed through that prism, particularly if you're trying to persuade someone like Donald Trump. Can you expand on that? What argument would you make that by supporting Ukraine, you deter China from moving on Taiwan?
So what does China really want? China wants unfettered control of what they see as their sphere. Obviously, President Xi has been very clear about the unification of Taiwan with the mainland. That's been a very clearly stated objective for quite some time. But actually, I'm even more worried about what they do against the Philippines, where the United States has a security obligation. What they do in the South China Sea, their threats against Guam, where we have one of our largest bases in the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, Japan and South Korea are both increasing their defense spending because they see the threat from China. So China's movements and preparations threaten sovereignty, threaten freedom of navigation, threaten international law, and are the exact same things that Russia is doing against Ukraine and in Europe. So in my view, if the United States and our allies were to help Ukraine stop Russia, we would be showing that we had the political will, the industrial capacity, and the military capability to stop Russia from doing those things. I think that would send a message of deterrence to China that we do have the political will and industrial capacity and so on. It's much easier to do it in Europe than it will be out in the Pacific. It takes a U.S. Navy vessel 9 days to go from Hawaii to Japan. So just to get a sense of the distances, which most of your listeners already will be aware, that's an enormous challenge in time and distance and logistics to deter China compared to Europe. So if we can't even do it in Europe, I don't think the Chinese are going to be very impressed with what we say about Taiwan or the Philippines or the South China Sea.
We've already mentioned some of the key figures in the second Trump administration, people like General Kellogg and J.D. Vance. And influential voices like Elon Musk and Donald Trump Jr. I wanted to ask you about a couple of other presumptive cabinet nominees, particularly from a kind of defense perspective. First of all, Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary. He's a former Fox News anchor, former Army National Guard officer. But is he qualified to lead a department with an annual budget of over $800 billion?
Yeah, of course not. You'd have to try real hard to find a worse candidate to be the Secretary of Defense. When you think about what the U.S. Secretary of Defense has to do, it's not only managing this enormous department with budget and numbers of people, but the fact that it's global responsibilities and interacting with counterparts from all of so many nations around the world and dealing with simultaneous problems in the Middle East, in Europe, in Africa, in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, these are all happening at the same time. That's normal jogging on any given day for the Secretary of Defense. Not to mention the things that come out of nowhere and that were unanticipated. So I don't see the maturity or mental capacity or intellectual curiosity even to manage those kinds of things. Now, you don't have to be a former general or have to have served in the Department of Defense 5 or 6 times to be an effective Secretary of Defense, but I don't see anything in his resume that would make him the guy that I would want us to have. I also have a problem with his. I just don't think he would be the kind of guy that would say, "Mr. President, I mean, you keep talking about Greenland, which is a territory of Denmark, a NATO ally. You keep talking about Canada, a NATO ally. It would. I don't think he would have the ability to push back on this and say, first of all, it's probably illegal to launch some kind of military operation or even talk about annexing territory that belongs to a NATO ally. That would be an unprovoked attack. And I have zero confidence that he would have the moral courage to say, we're not going to do this. This is unacceptable and probably illegal. The other thing is he's going to have a hard time, I think, explaining why women cannot serve in combat. And the way he articulates it, because yes, of course, we have women serving in combat different places, but he's talking about, in the traditional infantry armor kind of role. But that demonstrates to me he has no clue what modern warfare is all about, because there is no linear battlefield anymore, and that people in supply convoys and maintenance units and artillery and rocket units are going to be just as vulnerable to becoming casualties as has been the case over the last 20 years. And so does a woman have the strength to pull a casualty out of a burning vehicle? That could happen 30, 40, 50 miles away from where the so-called front is. And the fact is, there's not enough men in America that are stepping forward to serve. And so we have a practical requirement for women to be able to serve everywhere. Whether it's fighter pilots, submarines, or in infantry units, as long as they can meet the standard. And there's actually very few that even want to do this. Why would we shut that off? I think for the Secretary of Defense, this reveals some character and lack of understanding that add to his unfitness, if that's a proper way to say that.
The other cabinet appointment or presumptive cabinet appointment I wanted to ask you about is Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, whose nomination has been met with a lot of skepticism, to put it mildly, from many people within the intelligence and defense community in the US, with frankly some even thinking she may even be compromised. Do you share those concerns?
I absolutely share those concerns, mainly because of our allies. Uh, what I anticipate will be great concern or reluctance about sharing intelligence. It's not American satellites that provide all the intelligence that we use for everything that we do. Most of our intelligence comes from allies and all different types of intelligence sources, whether it's technical or signals or human intelligence and all the other ints that are part of that are disciplines in the process. And if UK or Germany or France or others, Estonians, are unwilling to share intelligence with the United States because of her, this only hurts us. And I don't know why anybody thought that she would be the ideal choice to be the director of national intelligence. Now, of course, you've got underneath the DNI, you have the CIA and the other intelligence agencies, but I don't I don't know why somebody thinks that she would be the best choice.
And when we talk about the concerns over Tulsi Gabbard and people, frankly, as I say, thinking she may be compromised, I mean, let's be blunt here. Is that the sense that she has been compromised by the Russians?
Well, I couldn't point. I haven't seen somebody point to a specific document that compromises her, but her open support for Bashar al-Assad, for example, that's gotten a lot of attention. How do you justify? How do you square that? And then some of the things she has said show that she is more understanding of the Kremlin than she is of Ukraine. So there's serious judgment. Um, Her judgment is certainly in question, and if I was an intelligence professional in any of the agencies out there, I'd be very concerned about, what does she do with the information? Where is she getting her information from? Where is she getting her information? And then, of course, this is not math. There's always going to be analysis. That's an important part of what you receive, and ultimately the recommendations and judgments that she would render based on all the hard work of the intelligence agencies and what she is able to share with allies. I would have no confidence that that would be the best analysis given her past support for Assad and the Russians.
Just finally, General, let's turn to the situation on the front line in Ukraine and also in Kursk. I mean, we haven't talked about it so much this time, but the geopolitics and what happens with Trump coming back, I think, is dominating so much at the moment. But what we have seen in recent days, for instance, is Ukraine reportedly capturing its first North Korean prisoners of war in Kursk. What should we read into that? In particular, Russia's increasing reliance, if indeed you think it is a reliance increasingly, on foreign troops.
So there's no doubt that Russia has a serious manpower problem, which is not something that most people would assume. But they have a manpower problem, which is why they're having to not only empty prisons, but also impress foreign workers that came into Russia thinking they were going to be working in some factory, and then they end up in a Russian infantry unit somewhere. And now about 12,000 North Korean soldiers have been put into combat. Uh, from talking to Ukrainian officers, I think that these 12,000 are divided up into 4 different brigades that are employed as just like Russian infantry. So their bodies basically into the meat grinder. I think President Zelensky reported the other day that it looks like about 3,000 of them have been killed or wounded. So already 25% have become casualties, and now you've got a couple that are captured. It'll be interesting to see what we learn from them, but it looks like North Koreans, to avoid being captured, are getting killed by Russians or their fellow soldiers if they're wounded to avoid becoming captured in many cases. And unsurprisingly, at least one of the two said that he thought he was coming there for training. So I, there's a lot behind the scenes that we just don't know yet about these guys. What conclusions can we draw from this? Um, the Kremlin still is reluctant to draft large numbers of troops out of Moscow and Saint Petersburg because they don't want a bunch of funerals in those cities. Most of the casualties are coming from the regions outside of Russia's 2 main metropolitan areas. So that allows the Kremlin to say to operate without worrying about casualties. It'll be a different story if they are forced to have to draft troops from those two main cities. So I think the North Koreans are filler. They're more fodder for the meat grinder.
And then talking of Kursk, Ukrainian forces have made further advances over the weekend, having launched new offensives about a week ago in the oblast. What do you read into that, and how much significance do you place on the offensive operations that Ukraine launched at the turn of the year in Kursk?
I think at the when this war is over and we look back on it and are studying different aspects of it, the Ukrainian counteroffensive into Kursk, which started back in August and just started a new phase the other day, as you referenced, is going to be seen as a brilliant stroke by the general staff. They took some risks, but they could see out in the far eastern part of Ukraine and around the Pokrovsk area that the Russians lacked the ability to overrun Ukrainian defenders. There is no potential of a breakthrough that they could then go racing to the Dnipro or something like that because they lack the capability. And so while the Russians are able to pound, and achieve very, you could call them micro gains, if you will, at enormous cost to themselves, there was no risk of a breakthrough. And so the Ukrainians saw an opportunity to change the narrative of the war, to regain the initiative, which is what every commander wants. Get the initiative, make the enemy respond to you instead of always responding to the enemy. And by launching this counteroffensive, three things for me stand out. Number one, in an age of drones where Russia has tens of thousands of drones, Ukraine was able to build up a large enough force and attack across the border into Russia, basically without being detected or disrupted. And now they just did it again. That's an incredible failure by the Russian side, but also showing the growing and improving skill of the Ukrainian side on operational security, and also I think improved use of electronic warfare, jamming. It seems like they've gotten really, really good at that. The second thing, of course, this creates a strategic dilemma for the Kremlin as they might potentially be approaching negotiations. And the idea that I think Zelensky and Lavrov both had put forward a few months ago was that any negotiations basically start with Russia gets to keep where the lines are, that's what they get to keep. That doesn't sound so appealing if you've got Ukraine occupying part of Kursk. And then the third dilemma is the operational level, actually dealing with it. They've had to divert a lot of combat power to try and eliminate the Ukrainian bridgehead inside Kursk. These are badly needed resources that can't be used somewhere else.
Well, General, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Thank you for the privilege. I always enjoy talking with you guys.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.